In this lesson, I suggest we go through all the files we have already typed and replace some of the usages of any type on more proper types. For example, inside activity.ts, we're using an any type for this parameter state, but since we have already declared an interface which describes state objects, we can leverage this interface in here instead of using any type. Let's also not forget to import this type up above and move on to the next usage of any type. As for the second parameter of the update activity function, instead of using an any type, we're going to use default TypeScript type, which is called partial. This is a generic type which accepts one type argument. In our case, we're going to pass in here type of activity. And what this notation is going to do is it will ensure that we can only pass those objects as the second parameter of this function with properties that exist on objects of activity type. And if we're going to reference some property on this field's variable which doesn't exist on objects of any type, right away TypeScript is going to let us know about it, that this is undefined property. So we have to use only those properties that exist on objects of any type. Which means in our case, we can only reference these three properties: ID, name, and seconds to complete. Moving on to the next place where we are using any type. Inside of constants.ts, we're using any type for period select option constant. But now that we already have declared return type of generate period select options function right here, we don't need to explicitly specify the type of the constant which receives return value of this function, because TypeScript is able to infer the type based on the return value of the function. There are also a bunch of places where any type is currently used inside of TS files. Some of these places we're going to come back to later on, and for now let's consider the following place. Inside timelineitems.ts file, specifically for update timeline item function, as the second parameter, we're using fields variable, just like we do for another similar function from activities.ts module, which we have already typed. And there we used partial type. So in this case, we're gonna use the same type, but as a generic type argument for the partial type, we have to use timeline item instead of an activity. And this way we will ensure that those objects that will be passed as the second parameter inside this update timeline item function should have only those properties that are present on objects of timeline item type. And this way we have made this function update timeline item a little bit safer. And lastly, let's go back to types.ts, and instead of using an any type for an icon property inside navItem interface, since all our icon names will be strings, let's use more specific string type instead of any. As always, link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.